Imagine spending day in and day out in a 6 by 8 foot room with no windows and blank white walls. There's overhead fluorescent lighting, a bare sleeping cot, and a steel toilet. The most stimulation you get on an average day is when a tray of food is pushed through a slotted opening. There's no clock on the wall, so you lose all sense of time. And there's no one to talk to, so you begin to talk to yourself. This is the reality for tens of thousands of prisoners in the U.S. on any given day.
Often people talk about it being eerily quiet, or else you hear echoing sounds like a door sliding open really echoes. You can imagine in some ways it's like walking into an empty building. There's no carpets, there's no paintings. Most often there's no natural light, maybe sometimes a tiny slit of a window.
That's Dr. Confinement Ryder, a professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society at the University of California, Irvine. She says that inmates are usually put in isolation because they're deemed to be uncooperative, violent, mentally ill, or need protection from other prisoners. Jump back to the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and up to 300,000 prisoners were placed in confinement for months to stop the spread of the virus.
While I think we were making immense progress pre-pandemic with reducing the use of these conditions, there's a national Stop Solitary movement. There has been legislation, litigation, administrative decisions from within prisons to reduce the length of time people spend in these conditions and the number of people in these conditions. All the facilities still existed, and they were a natural place to isolate people when COVID outbreaks happened. And so the thing I've heard the most is that in prisons, people were afraid to say when they started feeling bad or they had an exposure because they knew the most likely outcome was they were going to be placed in solitary confinement indefinitely.
Experts estimate that today, around a quarter to a third of prisoners cycle through solitary confinement during some portion of their sentence. About 8% of prisoners are in solitary at any given time, according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Some spend years locked up in this harsh environment for minor infractions.
There's a growing body of evidence that after even a few days in these conditions, even from experiments in the 70s around military trainings, that sensory deprivation can cause people to hallucinate, have real sleep disturbances, have intense anxiety and heart palpitations within even a few days. And these conditions, right, when we're talking about no access to natural light, fluorescent lights that are on 24 hours a day, no human contact for extended periods, these are very similar to sensory deprivation conditions. And in studies people have done, rates of suicide and self-harm in these units are often twice as high or higher than in the general prison population, where of course they're higher than in the general population of the country also.
Even after prisoners are released from solitary, the research has shown that it's led to lasting and severe damage. Paranoia, depression, heart damage, and a loss of social skills and identity are just some of the issues that have been previously reported. It's been well studied that the majority of inmates head into jail with mental health problems, and now it's only exacerbated. Tracy Velasquez manages public safety research for the Pew Charitable Trust and is an expert on criminal justice systems and practices.
What we've seen is that in terms of arrests, about 1 in 4 people who was arrested in the past year, according to the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, about a quarter of those people who were arrested had a mental health issue. They had either a serious or moderate mental illness. And we see this figure sort of go forward into jails as well. Other research by the Bureau of Justice Statistics also says about a quarter, about 26% of people in jails met the threshold for being considered having a serious psychological distress issue.
Velasquez says that prisons are legally required to provide mental health care. However, the quality of these programs widely varies from state to state. Some facilities have a large array of resources, while the rest are severely lacking. Ryder says that for inmates in solitary confinement, mental health treatment can often be unhelpful and uncomfortable.
If you develop some kind of psychological symptoms while you are in these conditions, there's often little recourse to get you out. So people might not even be getting enough care to know. And most often the way mental health treatment is provided in these units is someone, not usually a doctor, someone like a nursing technician with a little bit of mental health training just stops by the front of each cell door on the unit and kind of taps on the little tiny window and says, hey, how are you doing? That means that the person on the cell on either side of you and above and below you can hear everything about that conversation. And so people in solitary confinement describe that as a pretty hard way. That's how you would initiate any kind of need for mental health care, and people describe that as being pretty hard to want to do that in that kind of public environment.
Outside of healthcare workers, many correctional officers who interact with these inmates on a daily basis get little training or direction on how to adequately handle mental health situations.
Generally, in the United States, correctional officers have a few weeks of training at best before they become correctional officers and start walking the cell blocks. And one of the things that struck me spending time in these units is there's often people there who have been so difficult to deal with that they've been sent from forensic hospitals and mental institutions into the prison system. And then, so you've basically got doctors and nurses who said, we can't handle these people, and then you send them into a supermax or a solitary confinement unit with correctional officers who've had a few weeks of training and say, you deal with them. And of course that's frustrating and leads to trouble.
Ryder argues that there must be other alternatives to solitary confinement. Mentally ill or challenging populations shouldn't be automatically thrown into these cells and forgotten for weeks, months, or years. And what happens after a person's done serving their sentence? How are they expected to become functioning members of society when they've spent 22 to 24 hours a day locked up in a box? The Bureau of Prisons, which manages federal prisons, has admitted that solitary confinement isn't an effective deterrent for bad behavior. They've also agreed that it can increase future misconduct. Yet, despite this, policies still excessively rely on this inhumane form of punishment. As prison population numbers tick back up, the future remains uncertain for the 1.2 million behind bars. To learn more about solitary confinement and our guests, Dr. Karamit Ryder and Tracy Velasquez, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment originally aired in November 2021 and was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.